From an informal start, let me welcome you formally to this panel event in memory and honor of the work of Shabbir Akhtar. My name is Martin Whittingham. I'm Academic Dean here at the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies. We're really pleased to have members of Shabbir's family joining with us, and former students and friends and others from, I haven't looked at who's online, all over the world, I suspect, and people still joining now. So a very warm welcome to you all. You won't be hearing much from me. The main chair of today's event is my colleague, Dr. Ida Glaser. So my job is really just to welcome you to the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies. As most of you or all of you will know, we exist to encourage the serious study of Muslim-Christian interactions, not least of which is engaging seriously with the other faiths, tradition or texts and so on, which obviously is exactly what Shabbir did in the work that we're going to talk about today. Before I hand over to Ida, she has asked me just to say a couple of moments on the figure of the Apostle Paul in Islamic writings through time, literally 2 minutes, because obviously Paul is the focus of Shabbir's book that we'll be primarily looking at today. So just a very, very brief piece of context, and then I will move out of the way. Can I check? I am audible to those online. Someone give me a wave. Yes, good. Thank you. So there's no explicit reference to Paul in the Quran. There is occasionally a linkage of him to Surah 36, 13 to 14. I'll just read you a little bit of that. I'm going to dwell on the early centuries and then much more briefly later. This verse says, "And relate to them the case of the people of the city when the messengers came to it. When we sent them 2 men, but they denounced them as liars, and so we reinforced them with a 3rd. Then they said, we are indeed messengers unto you." Now, Ibn Kathir, amongst others, connects that to Paul being one of them, but that's relatively unusual in my understanding. There's no reference to Paul in Hadith literature. His profile in Islamic writings grows from small beginnings in brief and neutral historical reports. Excuse me. So Ibn Ishaq, his seerah, the life of Muhammad, he mentions Paul without criticism. He writes, "Those whom Jesus, son of Mary, sent, disciples and those who came after them in the land, were Peter, the disciple, and Paul with him." And you find that same tradition in At-Tabari, the famous early historian. You also get, again, a neutral reference in the Fihrist of Ibn Nadim. Those of you who know this literature, a long cataloguing of lots of books in the early centuries, and it mentions Christian works and mentions the works of Paul alongside the Gospels. Again, quite neutral. But there is a more negative tradition of accounts of Paul, which emerges quite early and then is picked up a little bit later. And it's really to do with a warning. I won't mention all the names of early figures in Islam, but it's really a warning to say, beware of divisive figures who undermine the true religion, i.e. Islam. And here's an example of Paul, who undermined true Christianity, i.e. from a Muslim point of view, the original teachings of Jesus, because that becomes Paul's central role, is to be the one that gives an explanation. He is the explanation for why the true teachings of Jesus, original teachings of Jesus, have become what we could call historic Christianity, which Muslims would see as off the path in certain ways. So Paul is then used as a warning. There are various explanations of it, of him basically leading Christians astray so that Jews will see more clearly that they shouldn't join Christianity. That's one explanation, for example. So it's Paul as conspirator. And there are various variations on that, of Paul introducing false ideas like abandoning food laws, abandoning the direction of prayer, and obviously ideas to do with the divinity of Jesus. Now, this negative portrayal of Paul as something of a conspirator is picked up quite strongly by people like Ibn Hazm and others, and really goes on. That's why I'm going to switch. I can't claim to have read everything and give you an exhaustive summary. I shall finish in a minute. But just to say that is quite a consistent thread where Paul occurs, and he doesn't occur everywhere, but where he does, it's usually with a negative hue. Just to give you a couple of quick examples, In modern-day Indonesia, you have Ar-Raniri, who was an Indian who became Sheikh al-Islam in Aceh. He mentions the story of a Jewish leader deliberately corrupting Christianity so as to divide the Christians. It's a clear reference to this tradition of Paul, even though he doesn't mention the name. Excuse me. And then in 19th century India, you have these two contrasting figures. Rahmatullah Kairanawi, who wrote Izhar al-Haq, some of you will know that work, who calls Paul a traitor and a liar, but you have a more positive reference to him in Syed Ahmad Khan's work, an Indian educationalist and reformist. Syed Ahmad Khan, unusual. It's just a brief reference, but it seems quite positive. But in general, that's not the flavor of things. And that's really a context for coming to Shabbir's work, where he engages, as we know, really quite seriously and in an unusual way with Paul. So I shall stop there and lead you into the rest of the evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin. Well, we're here to remember and appreciate Shabbir. And then we're going to go on and have some, I hope, vigorous discussion of his work. And I can't actually think of a better way to remember Shabbir than to discuss his work and have, I hope, some healthy disagreements over it. It's only sad that he's not here to help us to disagree. I'd like to start just by reflecting a little from my perspective on where this book came from, this book on Galatians. I wrote a paper on reading Galatians in the context of Islam back in the mid-90s. And there's a version of part of it published in an obscure place. This is the Journal of the Caribbean School of Theology, believe it or not, Graduate School of Theology. And in there, I was comparing Galatians to what was going on actually after the Battle of Uhud, as the Muslim community is developing, and seeing Galatians as very parallel to that, as a situation when it's kind of very touch and go as to what is going to go forward in this particular religious movement. And particularly as a situation, in both situations, you've got enemies. In both situations, you've got questions about authority. In both situations, it's interesting, it's about how this new faith is going to relate to others. What's going to happen as people from other tribes or non-Jews come into the faith? What are you going to do with the basic original culture? So I was seeing a whole lot of interesting parallels there. And sometime after that, somebody commented to me that there was this Muslim scholar who was taking an interest in Paul. So when I was teaching in Birmingham, I wrote to Shabbir and said, would you come and give us a lecture? And he said yes, but then he went to America and he didn't do it for us, and we lost contact. And then when I was setting up this reading the Bible in the context of Islam here, I thought, we need a Muslim scholar to work with us. Where can I find a Muslim scholar who can do some serious biblical study? And I wrote to Shabbir. And to cut a long story short, he spent, was it 5 or 6 years here? And
I'm not sure, 4 or 5.
And this is one of the things that came out of it. So we're very thankful, and I've been rereading it and I'm even more thankful. But I'm mostly chairing, so I'm not allowed to say too much. We have with us here Dr. Shirin Shafaie and Dr. Danny, what's your second name? Crowther? Sorry, I am so emotionally upset by not having Shabbir here that I may not be thinking quite as clearly as I usually do. But both of them were working with us on this project. So I'm going to ask them to give us some short reflections. Shirin, would you like to start?
Yes.
You want to pray?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And I'll complete. Okay.
Thank you so much, Ida. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Hello and greetings to Shabbir's family who are joining us. My name is Shirin. I'm one of the members of the Reading the Bible in the Context of Islam study group, and I've had the privilege and really the joy of working with Shabbir for several years here. And as a result, we published a book called Reading the Bible in Context of Islam. And we might have something from the book launch to share later on. But anyways, what I want to reflect on today is not on Shabbir's academic work specifically, but on how I saw him and how like three aspects of his character that stood out to me. So one, Shabbir as a philosopher. For me, first and foremost, he was a philosopher because he always asked the hard questions and, to use his own words, quote, deceptively simple child questions, unquote. He would tutor students during the summer school. You can see here they're sitting in a circle and talking, and I did an interview with him and asked him what is his role, and he said that. He said, my role is to ask these deceptively simple questions. For example, why are you asking that question? Not to, the question itself, but the reason why that became a question for you as a student. What are your assumptions behind these questions, or things that students may not have thought of, but a philosopher would immediately think of. So he would always even question the question. And for me, that really stood out because my background is also in philosophy, and we could really relate on that level. It's always a joy to talk about Kierkegaard with him. He was a big fan of his work, but again, I think first and foremost, Shabbir was a philosopher, then a theologian and a poet. Secondly, and this for many of you who have known him personally, you will resonate with this, his sense of humor. He had such a unique and profound sense of humor, and I really mean both of these words, unique and profound. He could always lighten even the most intense scholarly debate where everybody is disagreeing with each other, and with a very well-timed joke, which was extremely appropriate, while at the same time being really funny. And that's really difficult to achieve. So I'm not going to even attempt to quote him because I will not succeed. You just need to know and have met him and heard him make those, to show his sense of humor that I think really was a very unique part of his character and made working with him even more enjoyable. On a more serious note, and the third aspect of his character that I think really resonated, and you can see it in his work as well, was his political activism. He was a political...
I'm deeply sorry.
He was a political theologian and activist. He knew and he was aware, deeply aware of the political imbalances between the contemporary Christian and Islamic world. He was not shy about talking about these things, even from his earlier work on the book that he has written against Salman Rushdie, Be Careful with Muhammad. He was always aware of the imbalance of power between the two, not just communities, but more generally and globally, the powerhouses that be. And he knew that. And that was reflected in his unapologetic stance with regards to his faith, but also with regard to how he saw the Muslim community should carry itself vis-a-vis the powers. What he said, one of the things he said, and I was just reviewing it last night again in preparation for this tribute, he said that and theological curiosity stems from a place of privilege, and specifically military and economic privilege. Once you know that you're safe in your position in the world, militarily and economically, then you can go and be curious about other religions and do academic work about them. But that's something that the Muslim world today does not have. And he really believed in that and anchored his own work towards or based on that belief. Yes, thank you. That's it. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
We're playing dancing chairs here. So it's my turn to sit in this chair for a short time. So there were 4 people in this project reading the Bible in Islamic context. And it was really Ida's vision. And I was the last to come to it. So Shabbir and Ida and then Shirin. And then I came from a biblical studies background. I finished a PhD in Hebrew Bible manuscripts. So nothing really to do with Islam. So my introduction really to this whole thing of Muslim Christian things was, as Ida asked me, to closely read and comment on Shabbir's first manuscript. And so I interacted with all the things I disagreed, and I put them in virtually every page I disagreed with ideas and intensely interact. Sometimes I wrote more than he did, and handed this back to him. Now, this is really interesting because you could respond in all different ways. Shabbir was delighted. He interacted with everything I said. He took account of it all, and he agreed with not one word. Which is absolutely remarkable, sort of, fully understood, completely different. And I think that's probably all I have to say. Really, is that was Shabbir. Is just listened, understood, and then never knew what he was going to say, and almost certainly wouldn't agree with me. And so massively stimulating. That was my experience. So that's me. Done. Do I go?
The New Testament in Muslim eyes, and the subtitle is Paul's letter to the Galatians, which is considered one of the earliest letters of St. Paul to a group of churches in Galatia, in Asia Minor, what's modern Turkey. And the reason I wrote this book is because I wanted to explore the Christian faith, its key document, in some depth. So this is a commentary, like a tafsir, on the Greek text. And inside the text, Paul quotes from the Hebrew Bible, so you also have to have knowledge of the Hebrew text. And it's a very important book. I meant the letter of St. Paul is a very important epistle or book. It's called a book as well as an epistle because it is about the fact that the law of Moses is not required. To be righteous and to be good and to be saved, all you need is faith in Jesus Christ. So obviously it's a very important subject for Muslims too, because we are a law-based religion. We do believe that the law of Moses, the Torah, is still valid. For Jews, of course, for Muslims there's the Quran and the Sharia, but Jews and Christians are meant to follow their own laws, which has when Muslims ruled the world and they gave the people of the book certain rights, one of them was that they should practice the laws of God. But the letter to the Galatians is about the problem of circumcision, which is a central symbol of the Jewish faith. And this letter argues that you don't need to follow such rituals and symbolic acts. All you need is faith. You do not need to do the works of the law, which would be like fasting, praying regularly, canonical prayer, what is required. The book has actually got a general introduction in which I discuss the question of Christian-Muslim relations, the political diplomatic enterprise. And then after that, there's an introduction to the commentary, which looks at the setting, the location of the letter, the destination of the letter, some technical details. After that, it looks at the 6 chapters of the letter itself in great depth, meaning looks at the Greek words, looks at other commentators in the Christian religion. Of course, there are no Muslim commentators. This book is unique in that it does not have any other precedent. No one else has written a tafsir of this type. And then the final chapter, in the conclusions, I look at the question of what is the future of these 2 religions in their dealings in the world, since these 2 religions, Christianity and Islam, are the 2 religious superpowers, if you like. And relations between them will determine global peace. If there's no peace between them, then unfortunately there'll be a war on a world scale. So the final chapter is partly political and partly gives the final verdict that I, as a Muslim who believes in the Quran, must give, which of course is that Paul is mistaken in thinking that the law is redundant. The book is written for the educated general reader, so it's accessibly written, even technical nomenclature and terminology is explained. But primarily I would expect philosophers of religion, people in comparative religion, obviously committed, devout, evangelical Christians will want to reply to it. They may feel challenged by what I'm saying. They may think, for example, I misunderstood Paul. I want Muslims to read it too, so that they can understand in depth the Christian rival and why, Christians believe what they believe. In other words, if we are to avoid misunderstanding and slandering each other, we should have an accurate knowledge of each other's faith, not a caricature of it, like some of the things that evangelicals say about Islam are completely untrue. And similarly, some of the things that Muslims say about Christianity are not true. And this is a nuanced study which gives a sympathetic reading of Paul's outlook, his interpretation of the significance of Jesus Christ. And then finally, of course, it argues that Paul is mistaken, because as a Muslim, my final place of judgment will be to go back to the Quran.
Thank you. So we're now going to go to Dr. Paul Fiddes from Regent's Park College here. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ida. Well, I'm so sorry not to be there with you in person to honour Shabbir. But COVID, I'm afraid, has kept me from being with you in any other way than in cyberspace. But today, I do want to explain why I consider Shabbir's book to be an important commentary on St. Paul's letters of the Galatians, and to unfold a little why I wrote the commendation on the cover, which ends, "This commentary is remarkable, provocative, and essential reading." Essential here means not just for those interested in Muslim-Christian dialogue, but also for all those interested in Paul and his message. Saying something about the commentary should also make clear why I consider Shabbir to have been an exceptional conversation partner with Christianity, and why his passing from us is such a tremendous loss to relations between the 2 faiths. Well, let's start with the method by which Shabbir approaches his commentary on Galatians. He places his commentary in the Islamic form of tafsir, which he claims is unusual because tafsir is normally used only of commentary on the Quran. Tafsir, he explains, is a defensive or didactic explanation. In other words, he's offering what in Christian exegesis is generally called a theological commentary, reading the text through a perspective of theology as it's developed in the church, while not neglecting the attempt to find the original intention of the author in his historic time and place. Shabbir, uniquely, I think, is attempting a kind of double tafsir, reading the text both in the light of Christian theology and of Islamic theology based on the Quran. So he places the text in the wider context of interfaith relations, with a deep understanding of the theology of the other faith, Christianity, a point to which I'll be returning. So let's take an example of this theological approach or interfaith tafsir regarding the person of Paul himself. From the perspective of tafsir, he says affirmative things of Paul's designation of himself as a servant of God. He takes Paul's statement that through Christ's death the world has been crucified to him and associates it with the Islamic sense of martyrdom. He writes, Jesus and Paul were Jewish martyrs who laid down their lives, and their struggle, he says, was a spiritual one. However, he judges that Paul's claim to be an apostle, or in Islamic terms, a prophet, is a weak one. In his concluding pages, he even judges Paul to be a lost prophet. Now, Shabbir has deliberately chosen to follow a Reformation exegesis of Galatians, understanding exegesis as uncovering the meaning the text would have had for the first audience. Notably, he follows the exegesis of Martin Luther. Now, he knows that other interpretations are available, but he regards Lutheran interpretation as standard and believes that Luther has truly understood Paul. So he reads Paul as totally replacing the works of the law by God's grace, and he understands works of the law as virtuous deeds or acts of the virtuous will. And this allows him to bring the epistle into dialogue with Islam and the Quran, which stresses grace precisely through keeping the works of the law, what Shabbir calls a juridical monotheism. Shabbir knows about alternative exegeses. In particular, he knows about what is called the new perspective on Paul, which maintains that the works of the law being opposed by Paul should be limited to badges of Jewish identity, circumcision and dietary laws. But he disagrees on the grounds, he says, it's quite implausible that works of the law only refer to the subset of the Torah which specifies identity markers. And here several Christian post-New Perspective approaches agree with him in seeing a wider meaning for works of the law. However, while recognizing that Paul takes a softer approach to Judaism in his letter to the Romans, he doesn't consider an important view of Paul, and this has recently gained a good deal of support, that Paul's opposition to works of the law pertains only to imposing that law on Gentiles, and that he allowed and even encouraged keeping the law for Jewish Christians whose conscience required it. So I want to go on to some disagreements I have with his exegesis, and here I want to mention just two. First, following the reformers, Shabbir understands justification as God's act of discounting sin by imputation of the righteousness of Christ on the basis that Christ has fulfilled the law. In other words, this is a kind of legal fiction that the reformers advanced, that the righteousness of Christ is transferred to sinners. Understanding justification in this way allows Shabbir to find an even deeper polarization between Paul and the works of the law. Christ has fulfilled them, so we don't need to. In fact, it seems clear that Paul did not have this Reformation view of justification. For Paul, it meant a restoring of right relationships between human beings and God, and Shabbir doesn't consider that. Second, again, following the reformers, Shabbir understands atonement in Christ to be expiation of sin by the satisfaction of God through the death of Christ. By contrast, Muslims, he says, understand sin to be expiated by the inner sacrifice of every worshipper, yielding the will to God. God's grace is essential for Muslims, but it isn't based on the expiation of sin by somebody else. Now, Shabbir rightly understands Paul to be saying that the death of Christ has expiated sin, but Paul himself doesn't consider this to be by a satisfying of God's wrath against sin. Some Christian doctrines of atonement have maintained this, and in the Reformation, particularly Calvin. But another tradition has found God to be satisfied by the response of the repentant sinner, while finding that the sacrifice of Christ precisely enables this response. Christ then expiates sin by changing the attitude of the sinner. Such an approach might be more coherent to a Muslim mind, but Shabbir doesn't consider it. But let's move on to the real issue. Regardless of these disagreements that a Christian theologian like me might have with Shabbir, he has put his finger on the decisive difference between Christian and Islamic theology. Shabbir understands Paul as encouraging virtuous deeds. He doesn't portray Paul as a libertarian. He thinks there's a convergence of Islam with Paul in Paul's stress on faith working through love, understanding this process as a work of the law, faith working, and love as charitable deeds. But Shabbir's question is how that can possibly be achieved without obedience to the revealed law of God. What makes Shabbir such an exceptional dialogue partner is that he understands the heart of Paul's gospel and indeed Christian theology as a whole. He sees that Paul believes that the motivation for faith working through love is the Spirit of Christ working within the believer, not obedience to a written code. So for Paul, the inner intent of the law is actualized in the Spirit. For a Christian, the incarnation of Christ, making this possible, is the alternative to the written code. Shabbir rightly underlines Paul's phrase, walking by the Spirit. Shabbir clears the ground, as it were, for Muslim-Christian dialogue. He sees the real difference as being between an ethic grounded in the energy of the Holy Spirit in the inner being and an ethic grounded in obedience to the law of God. But he finds this difference to be an impassable blockage. He writes, "The deadlock is permanent." In his view, the inner motivation of the Spirit of Christ is just not adequate for living a good life in the everyday world. So he writes, Christianity does not hallow the mundane, the everyday, despite its belief in incarnation. And his reasons for rejecting this alternative to a law-based and law-guided life are several. First, he finds that the idea of the incarnation of God in Christ as the basis for an inner spirit of Christ is simply a category mistake. He understands the Christian claim that God is truly divine through suffering and humiliation, but thinks that we're not then talking about God any longer. He rightly thinks that incarnation can't be held with an impassibility and immutability of God, though some Christian theologians have tried to do so. Shabbir also then rejects Paul's image of himself as the servant of a Lord of weakness. It can't be true servanthood, he says, if the Lord being served is weak. Second, Shabbir finds Paul's whole language of sonship to be deeply problematic, not just Christ as Son of God, but the idea that a believer shares in this sonship of God through adoption, and so has the inner motivation of a son. In summary, the Christian idea of a lawless faith is, Shabbir judges, a regression to a more primitive stage of religion, I quote. He writes that, I quote, "It is closer to a primordial paganism, a mystical pantheism infused with a vague notion of a human divine interface whereby nature and the supernatural meet." The problem, he judges, is that such a view offers no guidance on how to live well. Just how much Shabbir understands Christianity and just how great a deadlock he thinks there is, I think, shown by that paragraph. The only way forward, he concludes, is for each faith to conclude that the other is in error. So Shabbir leaves us with a question. Is he right? Are we simply in deadlock? Shabbir has cleared the ground in an exceptional way for us to face the question, and that would take more than a panel convened in his honour this afternoon. But I suggest that his own commentary actually takes us beyond deadlock, showing how fruitful is his method of a double tafsir for understanding one's own faith as well as the other. This kind of double tafsir draws on the theology of two faith traditions, and that will result in greater convergence, not unity. Each may hold that there is error in the other, but the other will still throw light on one's own convictions. I mean, he shows that Paul's stress on grace gives a depth to Islamic understanding of grace, leading Shabbir himself to say more about that than many commentators on the Quran. On the other hand, a Muslim's stress on the centrality of works of love, as Shabbir expresses it, should enable a deepening of the Christian understanding of faith. Well, that's what I would like to say, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We have with us online Dr. Saqib Hussain and Dr. Abdulla Galadari and also Dr. Richard Schumack. And here we also have Dr. Max Baker-Hytch. Sorry, sorry. As well as Martin and Shirin and Danny. So I just see, would any of you like to make a short comment on what Paul Fiddes has just said before we go on to our next input? Yes, go ahead, Danny.
I was immediately thinking this was what I really enjoyed, is this concept of disagreeing, but actually enjoying disagreement. So having somebody who you completely disagree with, but actually who helps you know who you are, and actually you enjoy the fact that they're not the same as you.
Yes.
And I think that's what Paul was, what for me, that's really stood out from what Paul was sharing, was that same sort of immense enjoyment of somebody who took a different opinion and then somehow gave you a mirror to see yourself better.
Yes, and a clarification of difference.
Yes.
So the move from what appears to be a grace versus law discussion to actually it's not grace versus law, it's spirit versus law, and it just shifts the conversation. Yeah,
it's the recognition of inner motivation. I find that exceptional, really, in Shabbir.
Yeah. But in conversation with him, I think after the whole manuscript went in, I can remember saying to him, what I've come to is that the basic difference is, what do you universalize from Judaism or from the initial Arab Islam? And the question is, are you going to universalize the rule of God through law, or are you going to universalize the presence of God through the Holy Spirit? I can remember him saying, yes, an agreement for a change.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you. Okay, let's go on to listen to what Saqib has to say. Saqib from California today. You're going to tell us something about Shabbir's view of Abraham, and then Max, you're going to do something on law and grace. Go ahead, Saqib.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, great. So thank you for convening this panel. Thank you for the invitation. I had the good pleasure of meeting Shabbir several times while I was a default student at Oxford, and I can attest to his wicked sense of humor and his raucous laughter at both at his jokes and at my not so good ones. So wonderful to be with you all today. And I have to confess that despite meeting and conversing with Shabbir several times, I never had the opportunity to engage with this work. So it's an additional pleasure to be able to do that. I'd like to begin with a quote, if I may. There's several just quotes from the book which just stay with you, which stand out so wonderfully. On page 186, he says, all families are to an extent dysfunctional, some being even essentially at war, albeit in a time of peace. However, no ordinary family is as enduringly dysfunctional as the Abrahamic one, not even the royal families and dynasties of the past or of the present, after all which feud has lasted 3,700 years and is still raging with fresh rigor. So very, very pleased to be able to contribute to that feud this morning or this afternoon. Okay, so Shabbir on Paul on Abraham. I'll begin with what I think is how the Quran's engagement with Abraham and the Quran's engagement with the Christian take on Abraham, the Pauline take on Abraham, is usually understood. And then I will move to how I think Shabbir complicates that in very interesting ways. So I think that if you were to ask most scholars, I think, who work in this space, what is the hermeneutic? What is the approach that the Quran has to Abraham, and specifically to Paul's take or to the Christian take on Abraham? The answer would be something like that the Quran tries to out Paul, right? It tries to outdo Paul in his own game. So while it finds common ground with Paul in certain respects, for example, so if we understand Paul as being a sort of Abrahamic originalist, right? Saying, well, in particular, you see this in this work that Shabbir is commentating on, that there's a covenant that God makes with Abraham which precedes the law and which cannot be undone by the law and which cannot be superseded by the law, and it's that covenant which is now being fulfilled with the coming of Jesus, right? So going back to kind of this original promise and between God and Abraham as what is at the core of Israelite religion that needs to be recovered and is being fulfilled through Jesus. Well, the Quran makes the same move on several occasions, right? So when talking about dietary laws and pushing back against some Israelite dietary laws, it says the patriarchs never kept these laws. It challenges the Israelites, bring the Torah and read it, right? Show us where the Israelite kept, where the patriarchs, where Jacob, where Israel, Jacob kept these dietary laws. So it finds common ground with that sort of Abrahamic originalism that Paul has. But then it goes beyond that. It sort of turns the table on the Christians, on Paul, if one might say so, and says that Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, right? He was a Hanif, a primordial monotheist, and he was someone devoted to one God alone. So if Paul can use Abraham in that way when conversing with his Jewish Christian interlocutors and their attitude towards law, what we find the Quran is doing the same thing when conversing with Christians and thinking about Christian attitude towards salvation, Christian attitude towards religion. When Paul insists on a natural law in Romans, the Quran also insists on a natural law. It calls it hikmah, and then insists that, well, this is the natural law that Jesus was teaching, and in this natural law, salvation comes through individual accountability before God for one's actions, right? So again, it accepts a lot of this kind of Christian premise, which becomes very popular in late antiquity, this idea of natural law, but gives its own take on what that natural law is. That natural law doesn't affirm salvation through through a vicarious atonement, but it affirms salvation through individual moral accountability before one's creator. So I think that's how most people would understand what the Quran is doing when it comes to Abraham, when it comes to bringing Abraham into this conversation with Christianity. Shabbir does something, I think, more innovative in several places, and sometimes I think he's pulling in different directions. I need to spend more time with his work, read it more carefully. It's always thought-provoking. But I'll maybe pick up on three threads that he introduces. Firstly, this idea of the promise that God makes to Abraham. And he discusses this idea, or Paul's idea of this original covenant with Abraham. And he does so in light of the Islamic legal category of abrogation, right, which is really innovative. So he questions, in a sense, the premise of, or the hidden premise of Galatians 3:17, right? But maybe can read from it. My point is this: the law, which came 430 years later, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to nullify the promise. And what Shabbir, I think, very cleverly does is say, well, firstly, we need to differentiate between promise and legal duty. And secondly, we need to bring into the conversation this idea of naskh, of abrogation, and of legal incrementation, which is the type of abrogation, right? You didn't have to do something and now you have to do it. Something was licit and now is illicit. So this idea of abrogation, which is suffuses the Islamic understanding of the Quranic law, and is also part of the Jewish tradition in terms, at least in terms of how the law incrementally develops. He says we need to bring that into the conversation and actually look at whether it is the case that we can accept Paul's original premise. So this is interesting. This complicates the standard response to Paul, right? The standard response to Paul, as I say, the scholars would be something like the Quran is doing unto Paul what Paul is doing unto this community in Galatia. But Shabbir is saying, no, actually, we need to question whether Paul is right in the first place. And by bringing this notion of abrogation or of the increment of the law over time, which is accepted by Jews, which is accepted by Muslims into the conversation, then maybe there's an alternative response to Paul that we can consider. A second thread, again, fascinating in his work, is this idea of descent through Abraham. So again, I think most Quran scholars would take the Quran as affirming that the audience, particularly the Arab audience to whom it is being proclaimed, see themselves as the physical descendants, the genealogical descendants of Abraham. And most scholars would, I think, understand the Quran as saying that because of this Abrahamic descent, the Arabs too have a right to this Abrahamic covenant. The Arabs too have a claim to prophecy. Muhammad too has a claim to being a rightful prophet of God, prophecy having been restricted to the lineage of Abraham. And Shabbir doesn't even countenance that. For him, it's very clear that genealogy in the Quran is spiritual. And so where the Quran refers to your father Abraham, Shabbir consistently understands that to be of your father in a spiritualized sense. So I want to say a few things about this. That firstly, it's an entirely plausible take on what the Quran is saying. Abraham's fatherhood has already been spiritualized before the Quran comes onto the scene, so the Quran may be tapping into that language. Secondly, it solves several problems, right? It solves why the Quran, while it talks about the children of Israel, the Israelites, the Bani Israel, does not talk about the children of Ishmael. There's no phrase Bani Ismail in the Quran at all, right? It solves this problem of how the Quran can sort of insists on a type of universalism, which it seems to do in several places. It talks about the prophet being sent to all of mankind, which would make sense if now Abraham is the father of all of mankind in some spiritual sense. And it's always a problem of the presence of non-Arabs in the earliest community of the prophet. On the other hand, we know that prior to Islam, the Arabs did consider themselves the children of Abraham. The language of genealogy is quite sustained in the Quran, so I'm not sure it's easy to spiritualize it all away. But nonetheless, Shabbir's take on this kind of notion of genealogy as being something which is sort of grounded in a spiritual fatherhood, I think has much to commend it. And finally, I think a third thread that I might pick out is the manner in which God's promise to Abraham finds fulfillment. Again, I think most scholars, perhaps including myself, although now I'm questioning this after having read Shabbir's book, would say that the Quran is certainly pushing back against this idea of an arc of a narrative salvation, or a narrative of salvation history arc that culminates in Jesus, right? That begins with the fall of Adam and that culminates in Jesus. And that's certainly, I think, the case. A strong case can be made that the Quran is in several places pushing back against this and flattening salvation history. It's not something that has started with Adam and finds a fulfillment in Jesus, but rather is punctuated by God sending prophets. And Shabbir, I think, would accept that. But what he also detects, I think, through a very interesting close reading of the Quran, is that there does seem to be, in certain instances, places where the Prophet Muhammad stands in place of Jesus as kind of the fulfillment of salvation history. So Abraham isn't given a promise of the nations being blessed through his seed so much. That doesn't happen. But what Abraham does do is pray that God will send a messenger to these people who will recite scripture to them, who will teach them wisdom and so on. And that messenger is
Saqib, I'm going to have to ask you to finish in a minute.
Yes. One minute, and I promise to finish. And that message finds itself fulfilled in the Prophet Muhammad. Just as, for example, Jesus' promise of sending a paraclete finds itself fulfilled in the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran, right? He doesn't promise a paraclete, but he promises instead the sending of Ahmad. So again, I think a third really interesting thread in to kind of explore further in Shabbir's work is his kind of close attention to the way in which the Quran has Muhammad not just another messenger in the series of messengers, but by seeing him in the light of kind of how he fulfills the Abrahamic legacy as the telos in place of Jesus, on which I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's great. Let's go on to straight on to Max.
Thank Ida for inviting me to this. So my name is Max Baker-Hytch.
Take the watch.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall and on the philosophy faculty at the university. And I met Shabbir in, I think, 2018, and we were introduced by a mutual friend who thought we would enjoy conversing as two philosophers, and that turned out to be very true. I have very fond memories of our lunches at the restaurant G Saheb, if anyone knows that one. That was a favorite of Shabbir's. We stayed regularly in touch during COVID, and despite Shabbir's serious illness during that time, we still managed to meet up occasionally. And something that others have alluded to is the way that Shabbir really enjoyed kind of robust, friendly disagreement. And we certainly used to converse about these sorts of topics. We talked about our mutual admiration for figures like Nietzsche, we talked about certainly the differences between Christianity and Islam. And I always appreciated the fact that we could have honest conversations within a spirit of friendship. So I hope I'm not going to repeat too much things that Paul Fiddes has already said. I find myself in agreement with Paul's comments. So I'm going to be treading around similar themes. So I mean, this commentary of Shabbir's is going to be in view here, and I think the first thing to say is that it's a really impressive piece of work, and I think it's a commentary that really anyone who's wanting to engage with Galatians should do business with. It's really a testament to Shabbir's scholarship and his deep familiarity with contemporary New Testament scholarship and his knowledge of the Greek and so on. But I think it is, of course, especially fascinating because, and as Shabbir rightly says, it is unique in that it's a commentary on a very important book of the New Testament by a Muslim scholar. I think it is a very it makes for a very fruitful explorations of the central differences between these two religions. So as Paul Fiddes already commented, Shabbir opts for a Lutheran Reformation reading of Paul, what you might call the old perspective on Paul. I think that actually there is merit in reading Paul in that way and in bringing Paul into conversation with Islam with that Reformation lens, because whether or not that is the correct way to read Paul, I happen to think it's not, but certainly that reading has been very influential historically and up to this day. And so it's Shabbir isn't kind of offering a straw man, as it were. I think that reading of Paul is enormously influential today. So Shabbir wants to read Paul in terms of advocating, as he puts it, a law-free faith, and he thinks that Paul, post-conversion, post-Damascus Road, may even have seen himself as no longer a Jew. So that is quite a striking claim. And as I said, I can see why Shabbir opts for this Lutheran reading of Paul, and it does make for a more striking contrast with Islam. Now, of course, and again, this is something that Professor Fiddes mentioned, that there is this reading of Paul, which has become quite popular, at least in scholarship. To what extent it's influenced Christianity outside of the walls of the academy is not so clear, but the so-called new perspective on Paul, which wants to see Paul not as rejecting Judaism, but yes, particularly as exercised by those early Jewish Christians who thought that Gentiles could only enter on condition of accepting these particular identity badges of identity, of Jewish identity, especially circumcision and food laws and kosher. So yes, my own inclination is to think that the new perspective is broadly correct. Now, Shabbir, I think, is probably right to think that it's not really plausible to think that Paul's only disagreement, with his opponents in the letter to the Galatians are those who are insisting on circumcision and kosher. Perhaps it goes a bit further than that. Now, I would just note that Jesus himself is depicted by all of the Gospels as having heated conflicts with legalists. And so I think actually it is plausible to see the diversity of Second Temple Judaism as having included legalists, not perhaps quite in the way that Luther would have thought of them, but So I think basically what I want to suggest is I don't think one has to sort of pit, you know, I don't think one has to think that Paul is completely out on a limb with respect to sort of Judaism more broadly in his time period. I think we can see plenty of evidence elsewhere that there were kind of conversations going on within Judaism about the extent to which kind of adherence to the law, especially the oral Torah, which had been seen to kind of greatly expand beyond the law of Moses by some, the extent to which one ought to adhere to that and seeing that as a kind of condition of ongoing membership of the covenant. So yes, as I said, I incline to think that the new perspective is broadly right. I think that it does better justice to the total data of Paul's letters. So not just Galatians, but also Paul's ethical exhortations. So especially if we look at the first letter to the Corinthians, you know, for example, Paul strongly kind of condemns a case of sexual immorality. Clearly is still seeing himself very much within that kind of Jewish sexual ethic. He expresses a strong abhorrence of pagan idolatry. So it very much looks as though he does see himself still as within a Jewish ethical tradition. He isn't a libertine, and Shabbir doesn't think he is. Another thing is that the Paul of Acts does a few things that German scholarship has tended to think can't be reconciled with the Paul of the epistles, but that, I think, is because German scholarship has been so influenced by Luther. So, you know, Paul in Acts does things like circumcise Timothy, pays for sacrifices in the temple, takes a vow, shaves his head, and so on. And the German scholars, at least, you know, German scholars of old, used to say, well, that the real Paul would never do things like that. Well, actually, again, the new perspective allows a more nuanced understanding of Paul's relationship to the law that I think lets us see how Paul could do those things and yet say the things he says in Galatians. So yes, I could go on. The last thing I would just note on that is, again, Paul's desire to see all Israel saved, you know, in Romans 9 through 11, kind of agonizing desire to see all Israel saved. It's, I think, hard to square with the idea that Paul thinks he's just left Judaism behind for this new religion, and that he sees his ancestral people as having no further role to play in salvation history. Okay, so that is sort of yes, that I think kind of outlines where I differ, I think, from Shabbir. However, I do think that Shabbir nails it when he sees the heart of the difference between Islam and Christianity in terms of their differing diagnoses of the human condition. So Paul Fiddes sort of put it in terms of the way that Shabbir contrasts sort of the spirit-empowered believer, the spirit-filled believer, in contrast with obedience to the law as kind of the crux of the difference between the two faiths. And I would agree with that. But I think Shabbir points to something that goes even deeper than that, and that is a different diagnosis of the human condition. So I know I've not got much time, but there's a particularly salient quote on page 250 of his commentary. And he says this: while the supremacy, priority, and primacy of Allah's grace is not a disputed thesis, the notion of a saving grace, a characteristically Christian idiom, is not a characteristically Islamic one, though it does occur in the Quran in verses that emphasize the fact that human affairs come to ruin without God's grace as the reality that intervenes to save sinners in their spiritually short-sighted and morally retarded conduct. In this sense, it is used as a refrain throughout the early verses of Surah 24, which refer to a sexual scandal in the Prophet's immediate family. This is the really key bit. Nonetheless, the notion of grace as saving us to court from the very condition of, as opposed to individual sins, is, at least in its fulsome development and detail, answering to an exclusively Christian anxiety about salvation. salvation. So it seems there's two different diagnoses about of the human condition, which lead to two very different remedies. So that there's a fundamental sort of ontological alienation from God, according to the Christian tradition. Whereas according to Islam, as Shabbir sees it, there's need for forgiveness from individual sins, but not the need to be rescued from a fundamentally broken condition. Yes, summing up, I would echo everything everyone has already said about the tremendous significance of Shabbir's scholarship in terms of the Muslim-Christian dialogue. And I'd like to pay tribute to Shabbir as someone who is a good friend to me and as a scholar who has made a deep and lasting contribution to the ongoing dialogue between the two largest religions. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's just take a few minutes to see whether anybody on the panel would like to make some further comment on Shabbir's work on Abraham and on the law and grace.
Can I ask a question to the panel? Sorry. Would that be all right, Ida?
Sure, if it's relevant to this particular bit, yeah.
Yeah, there seems to be a theme emerging around Dr. Shabbir's interpretation potentially being a Lutheran approach. Could it be argued potentially that he's employing what we would regard from a Quranic perspective as a tafsir al-Quran, the Quran approach, right? But relating it to the Bible in the sense that he's being more true to the text rather than it being an ideological perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be contested. So the people arguing for the new perspective, so James Dunn, N.T. Wright, sort of rooting their work in the earlier work of E.P. Sanders, they're going to say that their historical reconstruction is the more accurate one of Paul's intentions and his thought world and so on. So I completely respect Shabbir's right to argue that the Lutheran perspective is the more accurate reading of Paul. But I don't think the new perspective would think of itself as offering a post hoc sort of ideological kind of eisegesis of Paul. Those scholars would claim that they've got the more accurate reading of what Paul was about, I guess.
Yes.
Just as somebody who, I mean, I know that Shabbir was aware of the new perspective, the Jewish Paul, because that filled lots of my commentary on the sides. So this was a conscious decision of him. And I think, I mean, I don't know Shabbir's mind, but I think he was saying, because of his experience of Christianity, the Lutheran Paul was the one that he wanted to engage with. And he thought this is what represented what was the heart of Christian reading of the text. So I don't think it was a matter of ignorance of Shabbir, of thinking, I don't know new perspective of Paul. And it was much more that he was saying, this is how, if you like, the Paul that most Christians know and the one that I really want to interact with. So I think it was and I think that genuinely he really was making a decision there.
Yes, go ahead.
Can I come in here and say, I did mention in my presentation that he was aware of the new perspective. He discusses it, in fact, in the commentary. I also think that he's right in seeing some limitations in it. And our last speaker has, I think, underlined that there is now what is called post the new perspective, which tries to take account of the fact, that what Paul means by the works of the law can't be simply limited to these badges of identity. So I think both I and the last speaker did see Shabbir, in fact, as as really in a very sophisticated way, as it were, pushing forward into the debate, but nevertheless, post the new perspective, hasn't gone right back to Luther in the way that Shabbir did. May I make a comment just on the last observations by the last speaker? I wish I knew him better. I hope there'll be a chance to get to know him better, because I enjoyed his presentation.
You're both in Oxford. Feel free to.
I know, so I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, but he made the point that beneath this distinction Shabbir sees between the life in the spirit and the life under law, that Ida has already drawn attention to, there is a deeper dislocation, which is to do with the human state before God. I just wonder whether our last speaker has not, as it were, made that too polarized. You know, on the one hand, the Christian view is that we're totally alienated from God, need to be rescued from total godlessness, as it were, whereas the Muslim view is that human beings are all the time, as it were, in contact with God. I can see the point that he's making, but I wonder if it's slightly overdone, and that our speaker from America did point out there's a lot in Paul about natural law, in fact, and the fact that there is in the human heart an understanding of God's purpose for life. Paul is presented in the book of Acts, whether historically or not, as quoting one of the Greek poets, "In him we live and move and have our being." No, so the idea that human beings are in fact living in the presence of God and know something of God isn't just an Islamic idea, but is part of the Christian tradition. I'm sure he would agree with this, but I just wanted to say that I think here we can actually learn something from Shabbir here about the human state before God that is important to hear, even though, you know, there may be there are differences still there. So I want to learn from Shabbir there. As a,
Yes. Can we leave that in the air, maybe come back to it a bit later? There's interesting questions here I pick up between polarization for clarification, and then as you study the polarization, you begin to find that it's not so polarized as you thought, and we could continue with that. But let's now leave those aside, and we'll perhaps come back to some of this at the end. But I want now to go to Abdulla Galadari, who's in the UAE, and he's going to offer, I believe, some friendly critique from his perspective of what Shabbir was doing. Over to you, Abdulla.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for inviting me to this panel. Well, I guess I'm a bit unique amongst the panelists that I did not meet Shabbir in person. I've only met him online during the times of the pandemic. So I haven't interacted as much perhaps as the other panelists have with Shabbir, but even during those brief moments that we have interacted, we actually did respectfully disagree with one another pretty much all the time. I don't remember once in which we did agree. Sometimes I felt maybe he, even if he was convinced with some of the arguments, he would disagree just for the sake of disagreement. And I guess that's the philosopher in him. He wants to make some kind of conversation, and perhaps to him it was a mental exercise, a philosophical exercise of some sort, which was very good. It was very nice because that kept the conversation going. So basically, I know that Shabbir in his work, he explicitly says that he's trying to be charitable and academic. Although I did find throughout the book, his tone was a bit more polemical at times, sometimes had, generalizations that were completely unnecessary. And I'll just give a few examples of some of those things that perhaps I disagreed with. For instance, for example, sometimes Shabbir ascribes to Christians things that he explicitly suggests would not be the case in Muslim thought. For example, he suggests that Christian commentaries often avail of doing theology, which according to Shabbir is not the case to Muslim exegetes. Well, in reality, I think all kinds of exegesis is some kind of a theological exercise, whether it's from a Christian perspective or even Muslim perspective, because the vast majority of the Muslim exegetes do bring their own personal theology in their interpretations of different passages in the Quran. So it's not something unique to only Christian commentaries. We do find that as well amongst Muslim exegesis, which is usually always colored by the theology of the exegete themselves. Also, for example, I find sometimes like Shabbir claims that the Quranic narratives, from the Quranic narratives, we can reconstruct accurately the views, the beliefs, even the kinds of gossip and slander the Quranic audience had against Muhammad, for example. Well, if you consider the Quran perhaps like a very accurate historical text, maybe that's the case. But as academics and as historians, we cannot suggest, even though we've got, for example, many different texts that talk about, the conversations that happened between Moses and Pharaoh, whether it's from the Quranic narratives or even the biblical narratives, or also the rabbinic narratives from, the different rabbinic literature, such as the Midrash. In reality, we have nothing from Pharaoh himself saying anything at all. So we even though we've got so many different sources from different traditions, we can never, I think, really say that we can accurately reconstruct what Pharaoh believed or what he said. It's only what those narratives are narrating about, what Pharaoh was saying, and so forth. So I don't really know whether we can truly suggest that we can reconstruct accurately what, for example, the non-believing Arabs argued against. We can only say, well, that's how the Quranic narrative suggests they have said. But can we really truly reconstruct what the Jewish audience or even the Christian audience of the Quran, what the kinds of arguments they have said? Because actually, I mean, not only as historians and as academics, but even from a Muslim perspective, we do know that the Quran frequently paraphrases. It never, ever, ever quotes anybody, right? It's always paraphrases, because even, for example, the narratives between Pharaoh and Moses and the conversation between them, we have many different versions of those conversations within the Quran, which tells us that the Quran is pretty much paraphrasing the conversation. It never really quotes what Moses says or quotes what Pharaoh says. It only, paraphrases them. And that's even from a Muslim perspective, not just, from an academic or a historian perspective. And just like what Max, for example, said a little bit earlier, how, Shabbir looked mostly into the Lutheran Paul rather than the new ideas. But I think basically when we look into perhaps the Muslim-Christian relations from a popular perspective, maybe nowadays, a lot of the Christian-Muslim debates that happen today, they mostly come from the Muslim side. It's mostly from a Salafi perspective, and from the Christian side, it's usually from an evangelical perspective. And maybe this book is really great because it fits in this kind of conversation, this popular conversation between Muslims and Christians. But we have, I think, to keep in mind that the vast majority of Christians in the world are not evangelicals. And the vast majority of Muslims around the world are not Salafi either. Even though this is perhaps what we may find in social media, with YouTube debates, that's mostly the kind of debates between the Christians and Muslims. It's these specific, worldviews. But in reality, the vast majority of Christians and Muslims do not necessarily adhere to these kinds of worldviews. So, and Shabbir is very well aware. He is well aware in his book that he is approaching Paul in this kind of interpretation. However, for example, like in the part of the world where I live in the Middle East, basically Western Christianity is not the most popular kind of Christianity in the Middle East. It's mainly so I'm not just even talking about evangelicals. I'm not even talking about simply Protestants, but the whole Western Christianity and the Western Christian theology is different than Eastern Orthodox theology, for example, or even, for example, the Coptic theology or the Armenian Church theology. So they're very different. And it seems that that kind of Christianity has been always marginalized, I guess, maybe in terms of the kind of discussions that occur between Christians and Muslims, even though the vast majority of Muslims live along these types of Christianities, those that are marginalized, unfortunately. And so maybe perhaps of course, Shabbir living in the UK and living in the Western world, that's the kind of Christianity he wanted to perhaps be in conversation with. But it basically discounts the other kinds of Christianity, where I think most Muslims around the world live nearby Eastern theology in terms of Christianity, which I think has a completely different ideas and even interpretations of the Pauline epistles, including Galatians. Also, it's not just that. What's really great about Shabbir is that he's very honest. He's very, very honest. I know many, for example, academics who would hide themselves under the umbrella of secular universities, when in reality, whenever they're doing whether biblical studies or even Quranic studies, in reality they have a hidden agenda. With Shabbir, he's very honest. He does not have a hidden agenda. For example, he explicitly states, I remain a defender of this mainstream Orthodox faith of the universal congregation of the Ahl Sunnah. So he's very honest in how he's portrayed. He never tries to show that he has a hidden agenda. But basically, when Shabbir, so for example, in the book shows that he portrays Sunni Islam as unique in that it does not accept perverse reading of the Quran. But the question would be, like, to me, is who is to say, and according to what criteria would a particular Quranic reading be considered perverse? Because even if one considers the most literal reading of the Quran as the least perverse, well, we do find Sunni exegesis filled, including even Sunni legal schools of thought, that often diverge from the literal text. So no differently from other Muslim schools of thought as well. For example, I'll give you another example that Shabbir says in the book. He says in the book that fortunately, Kharijites ceased to exist. I do not know why it is fortunate that the Kharijites ceased to exist, but regardless, the Ibadis today do trace their roots to that kind of Muslim thought. And obviously, you ask the Ibadis, are you a Kharijite or do you trace yourselves back to the Kharijites? They will say, definitely no. But then you go to any, Christian school of thought and you tell them, do you trace yourselves back to the heretics? And they will tell you, of course not, because nobody will call themselves a heretic, right? If that's what they believe in. They wouldn't call their ideas and beliefs a heresy. And just like, Muslims similarly will never call themselves Khawarij, because Khawarij meaning, you're out of the path, you're an outsider. Nobody will call themselves I'm an outsider when I believe in whatever I believe in. So obviously nobody today will call themselves Khawarij, but we do have the Ibadis. Actually, our neighbor to the south, I'm in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and our neighbor to the south, Sultanate of Oman, well, the government is an Ibadi government, and many people there are Ibadis. So that school of thought do continue to exist. They didn't really simply cease to exist. I do find, for example, sometimes things that makes me also a little bit, smile when I read the book on the Shabbir's commentary on Galatians, because sometimes I feel I need to try to figure out what Shabbir is trying to mean by the definitions. Like he says, Muhammad was not a mystic. Well, what does Shabbir mean by a mystic? I mean, if you ask me, for example, if a person goes on top of a mountain for days at a time in solitude, meditating, not eating much, to me, that person seems to be very spiritual. Sounds like, what a mystic would typically do. So I had to try to understand, what exactly does Shabbir mean by a mystic? And then he later on, tries to suggest, a mystic means the commingling between the supernatural and the natural. And since Muhammad did not see himself as dwelling in the deity, or that the deity dwells in him, therefore he's not a mystic. But then in that sense, I can feel that, many mystics perhaps would also be considered non-mystics according to that kind of definition as well, because not every mystic would necessarily, have this kind of commingling between the supernatural with the natural. Shabbir finds, he basically criticizes mysticism in general, feeling that it deteriorates into a false version of an otherwise authentic religion. Well, so those are some of the things. There are some inaccuracies. I don't know if Shabbir was trying to be perhaps, maybe like caricaturing maybe Paul in some instances, or tries to have some kind of polemic or something like that. Because, like, for example, Shabbir suggests that Paul was from the house of Shammai. Now, most of the readers of the book would have no idea what he meant by that. I mean, you need to really be, very well versed in Jewish tradition to understand what that would even mean. But in reality, the vast majority of historians actually consider Paul to be from the house of Hillel, not the house of Shammai. So there are sometimes, some things that Shabbir puts in there that I feel, I don't know. I mean, the tone is a bit polemical, perhaps, trying to caricature Paul in other times, to show, something concerning about Paul. But otherwise, as I said, I mean, there are so many amazing and great insights from this commentary that Shabbir has written. So even though perhaps I may disagree with the general tone and generalizations that there may be in there, but there are so many different insights over there that are really rich and are great in a conversation for Muslim-Christian relations. And regardless whether we disagree, and as I said, even when I had those brief discussions with Shabbir, we always disagree. But those disagreements, I guess, is what makes the conversation going. And perhaps with this commentary that Shabbir has written, it would allow the conversation to continue between Muslims and Christians. And for that, I'm very grateful for Shabbir's work that he has done. And I am sure that it will continue to be important for many people who are looking into Christian Muslim studies. So, and with that, I'll stop here, and looking forward to further conversation amongst a panel.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think that what you've said, Abdulla, but also the other discussion we were having, it really raises the question of what was Shabbir actually doing? What did he think he was doing? How far are we to understand what he was doing as part of his incredible sense of humor? How far are we to understand the kind of polarizations and generalizations? This is a philosopher. This is not a theologian or a biblical scholar as such, although he spanned all those disciplines. how far was he actually trying to provoke? How far was he choosing the view of Christianity he was interested in? What was he actually trying to do? So Richard Schumack has said he's going to give us some reflections from his discussions with Shabbir on what Shabbir thought he was trying to do. Over to you, Richard. Thank you. Thank you for joining us from Australia in the middle of the night, I believe.
Yeah, it's 4:30 a.m., but I'm wide awake and very glad to be with you. And yeah, I would like to just make some general comments about Shabbir's overall project, if you like, his philosophical project. And I think you're right, Ida. I think fundamentally he would think of himself as a philosopher, not so much as a theologian, although he was humble and he was quick to sort of deflect claims that he was a strong philosopher, but that's certainly his project. And Abdulla, absolutely, he would over-argue, and he was an apologist and he was a polemicist, but again, with a smile and a poetry. I think people have already mentioned that he was quite poetic. So he had a rhetorical flourish to what he wrote, but I think underneath that, it was a philosophical project. And I like to think of him as sort of my alter ego in the Muslim world. He was certainly a far more significant thinker than I am. It's in my imagination that he's my alter ego, but certainly the project was a philosophical project. I think it was unique, certainly unique in modern times. And fundamentally, his project was to argue for a reasoned and a reasonable Muslim faith. I'm not sure if I'm able to share a screen, but I'll pop up a few quotes. Oh, no, it's disabled. That's all right. I'll just read them out. Some quotes from his wider corpus, not so much from the Galatians commentary. But he made claims like that there is nothing special about religious belief except its object.
You can share your screen if you wish to now, Richard.
Oh, okay, great. Let me do that. These are just a few different quotes from the Quran and the secular mind. And it's the second one particularly I think is great. The secular condition of godless humanity therefore becomes by default the only starting point for assessing traditional faiths. To see God as a terminus must be the calculated intellectual ambition of a valid epistemology of Islamic doctrine, and not the presumption of a pre-rational temper claiming revealed warrant. There's a lot of stuff there, too much to unpack in the 5 minutes that I have, but it really is close to a millennium since Muslim philosophers have been making these sorts of claims. He really is unique. He resisted, he recognized that the natural sort of tone of Islam or trend is to a sort of a fideism, and he strongly resisted that. He had a very clear commitment to justifying Islamic faith, and without any special pleading at all. And I think he was largely alone in this among Muslim apologists. There are many Muslim apologists who try and offer reasons for Christian faith, but for Muslim faith, but he really wanted a proper, robust philosophical reasoning to undergird his Muslim faith. And I think even if there are other Muslims who join with him in that, he went far beyond that in his research. His PhD was into Kierkegaard. Even the text of Galatians, there are very few Christians who know Galatians as well as Shabbir does. But he was very willing to step outside his epistemic tradition and to stand in the shoes of his opponents and to walk their road. That is unique. It's unique, and I think it was lonely for him. There were very few Muslims who were willing to go with him on that. There are very few Christians, I think, who were willing to meet him in the place where he thought the conversation needed to happen. He felt that, and I was not willing to go with him all the way either. Obviously, as a Christian, I think I loved his project of trying to come up with a fully justified Muslim faith. I don't think he pulled it off in the end. If I did, I would have become a Muslim. But I loved the project. That's the first thing I like. Second thing I'd like to say about him is that even that project undergirded an even bigger project for him, which was that this sort of reasoned, justified faith needed to step back into the public square. He was very, very keen for there to be a reasoned public theism. Let me share another quote. So this comes from Islam as Political Religion. And he says how Islam's laudable realism removes the necessity for that false antithesis of rendering unto Caesar the things that belong to Caesar at the expense of the things that rightly belong to God. Private piety is futile if one cannot dismantle the structures of evil. Shabbir was very keen, I think, for Christians and Christianity to join Islam and become a public theism, if you like. Certainly it needed to be a legal theism for Shabbir, as the first few speakers pointed out. For him, very much law and grace was for him. And Paul, I take your point about Max painting quite a sort of a strident separation between Islam and Christianity, but I think that's what Shabbir did. I think he really clearly resisted the full-on sense of the Christian gospel of grace, because he was very, very strong on theism being fundamentally legal. He had a nomocratic view of religion, and he wanted Christianity to join him, or to join Islam, if you like, and become a public faith. And he was not an idealist, even the quote that I just read out. He was very practical, but he was idealist in the sense that, again, I think he found it hard to get people to follow him into that space. He was frustrated that few people, he could find so few sort of deep, proper conversation partners in Christianity and Islam. And there's a sort of sadness for me in this, because he, and I was one who wanted to talk with him. Again, I couldn't go all the way with him because I just don't think Christianity has the legal DNA to do the work that he hoped it would. And there's a sort of a tragedy to this. There's an irony here, because Shabbir would regularly critique Christianity as being too tragic and not practical enough. But the tragedy was, I think he found so few people willing to go with him in this bigger project of making faith public, stepping into the public arena. Just one more quick reflection, and that is, despite the fact that he found so few sort of deep conversation partners on his journey, I think he kept going because there was an even deeper project, and that was that he really was interested in truth. And his faith was genuine and personal. And his philosophical project was driven by an underlying commitment to truth and wanting his Islamic faith to be grounded in truth. I have one more quote to show. And this is his sort of chastising of Christianity. He chastises it for being, or chastises the irrationality and demonstrable incoherence of Christianity's distinguishing dogmas, the impracticality of its deceptively noble ethics, and the implausibility of its gracious promise of unconditional salvation divorced from works of the law. I love this quote. I love his critique of Christianity here, partly because, and I get this more actually from the very many curries that we ate in Oxford and also in the US. And that is, this might seem like a strange thing, but at the personal level, I think and you can sort of see the hints of it in this quote, he almost wanted Christianity to be true, but he just couldn't bring himself to think that it was. And so he really did love the ideas of grace in Christianity and that idealistic ethics, the spirit-led ethic that people were talking about earlier on. He loved the ideas of it, but he just thought, well, that can't be right. And there was something about this that was, and Abdulla mentioned this as well, there was a deep honesty in this, and there's a humility in this, and there's a great generosity in this. He was profoundly generous in wanting to understand Christianity and to dig deeply into it. He was curious. There was a courage to this. The things he would say, both in his resistance of just a fideistic approach to Islam, but also the generosity of Christianity. Again, few Muslims were willing to go there, and he was seen as an outsider in many ways in his own community. But all this was driven by a relentless, and Abdulla used the word honesty again, but there was an integrity to him. And at the end of the day, he really was committed to being a rationalist. He just wanted to go where the evidence led him. And for him, it wouldn't let him become a Christian. He stuck with Islam. And I love that. Again, he was a kindred spirit. I love the fact that he pursued truth. We ultimately ended up in different places there. But he was a truth seeker, and I love that. And we were friends in that. And he was a great conversation partner. As people mentioned, he was fun. He was energetic. He was always engaging, and he would push back. And as philosophers, we love that. We love an argument. And so I love that about his project, and I'm going to miss him a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we have a little time left for particularly any members of the panel who would like to engage. If the panel doesn't speak up, then anybody else who is either here in person. The book is called The New Testament in Muslim Eyes. Yeah. Can we just give a minute to see if any of the panel would like to say something? Yeah.
Well, I'll just follow up, because a point I made at the end of my little talk got picked up. And Fiddes brought this up, that maybe I'd created quite a strong opposition between a Christian sort of picture of the human sinful condition and Islam's picture. And I think, just to clarify, so I don't sort of adhere to a kind of Calvinistic total depravity picture. And so, I think I would broadly agree with the things that Paul Fiddes was saying there, in terms of, I do see common grace there in the thought of Paul. But I think I also agree with what Richard Schumack said, which is that Shabbir, I think, did set up that quite strong contrast there, which maybe was a sort of a rhetorical device. But I think, again, I don't see Shabbir as strawmanning, because certainly that is a very influential strand of the Christian tradition. Yeah.
And certainly we had a lot of conversations here about whether human beings were fallen or not, or what that might mean. And one of the things he insists on is that, God made human beings with the evil as well as the good. God made us like that, rather than that the tendency towards evil is part of the fall. So that was certainly something that he discussed. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I
Shirin.
actually have a question posed to Abdulla Galadari. I really love his equally honest critique, because especially in occasions like this, people hold back, maybe, and then I really liked his honest critique. So I wanted to ask him a question. Since he had these many disagreements with Shabbir, and I would assume that some of the critique that he shared with us, he had already shared with Shabbir, especially in this idea of maybe Shabbir was caricaturing Paul in some places. I'm wondering if he had he had shared any of his views with Shabbir. What was Shabbir's response? Because I'm just really miss his voice right now to come out and say something. I'm sure he would say something, incredible. So if he has something to share.
Yeah. Abdulla, what did Shabbir say in response to these criticisms?
Well, basically, I do not want to misrepresent Shabbir, so I wouldn't really want to say what Shabbir said. I didn't tell him about all of these different things, like about how Paul he caricatures Paul sometimes. I didn't really specifically talk to him about that a particular example, but I don't want to also misrepresent Shabbir. So Shabbir is no longer with us, so Allah yarhamah, and I would basically, would keep it at that, and I would prefer perhaps to keep it at that. And if we want to listen to Shabbir, perhaps it's better to read it from his books directly rather than me trying to misrepresent him.
Thank you. Your question, go ahead.
Well, I just want to go back to the point that Abdulla was raising,
Yes.
this monolithic image of religions, all religions, and especially when we talk about Muslims and Christians. For example, in the subcontinent, and maybe it happened in the Middle East as well during the colonial period, the local people, not just Muslims, Hindus, elsewhere, they would look at Christians as Europeans. And then they would look at the Christians who were the local converts, and there were two different classes and two different typologies. So I think Abdullah's point is very valid, that Muslim-Christian debates or discourses or mutualities or commonalities have to be seen in reference to the lived experience, which is in the Middle East or areas where these communities exist. And I remember that in the early 90s, Shabbir used to write for Times Higher Education supplement.
Indeed.
And one of his articles, it just came to my mind, he was, I think, reviewing a book, and he said about diversity, this plurality, which could be very confusing, but that's the beauty of being a human being. And he said, he quoted something from Arabic into English. He said, while deciding between mosques, I became an infidel.
While deciding between mosques,
Because there were too many mosques, and as a Muslim, I couldn't decide which one I have to go to, which one belonged to my fiqh or my firqa. So in other words, he was talking about pluralities and diversities in any kind of theological, tradition.
Yes.
So I think Abdulla is right that maybe, this is where, the whole concept of religion as a monolithic tradition, a kind of Western concept, looking at religion or tradition, whatever, in the colonized world, and we are sort of stuck with it. We consciously or subconsciously start taking them as into one uniform, kind of system.
Yes.
While there might be many subsystems competing, conflicting.
Yeah.
And for example, this, debate which took place in the late 19th century in India, the interfaith debate, especially in the UP on Allah, which was organized by a British official. Yes. And there were Hindu Arya Samadhis and Muslims and all that. So I think I want to go back to that, reality or plurality.
Yes, and Shabbir was certainly aware of that. And I mean, personally, I think that one of the things that was going on and he in fact makes it explicit, is that he was in many ways more interested in the interaction between Islam and secularism than the interaction between Islam and Christianity. And one of his major interests in Paul was that he thought that Paul's thinking was the determining factor in the development of European thinking. And he also thought that this disjunction between law and grace was something that had fed into the development of the secular world. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was so interested in the Lutheran reading of Paul, because he saw that as what was at fault in producing A, European civilization, B, all the aspects of Christianity in the West he didn't like, and C, the secularization of society. I may be overstating the case, but as Shabbir would say, you know, if you're being a philosopher, you have to overstate the case, and you have to develop your categories clearly. And you know,
So just to say that there's quite a long comment from Dan Brain. If you just click your chat, have you got the chat up?
Sorry, on chat, comment from Dan Brown. Shabbir's work on Galatians seems to me to neglect the kind of lively, continuing conversation with prior commentators and scholars that is often a distinctive feature of good commentary, whether biblical or Quranic tafsir. Often the book seems like a three-way conversation, Paul, the Quran, and Shabbir. Is this not a very modern, even fundamentalist way of reading? If I'm right, I wonder if this characteristic goes some way to explaining some of the weaknesses that Abdulla Galadari finds in the book. Shabbir's perspectives are often idiosyncratic, showing little concern for prior traditions of interpretation or for variation within the Islamic tradition. At the same time, such eccentricity is one of the features that makes this book, like so much of Shabbir's work, lively and interesting. Oh, yes.
Can I add a brief comment to that?
Yeah, go ahead, and then we have two comments from the floor. Yeah, go ahead.
Just that I provided him with a copy of my book on the history of Muslim views of the Bible to review. And eventually he gave it me back and said, I can't review this. I want to know what you think. That connects with, similarly he used to say, I'm not an academic, I'm a thinker. And you can remember that too, yes. But it's made me think about, how do I write history of other people's thinking? But he said, no, I need to know what you think.
Yes.
And that's what he was doing in that work, I think. We know what he thought.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Ida, and all the panel for holding this event in memory of Shabbir Hussain. His first wife and my children are here, and I just want to touch on the sorts of memories and which have been jogged by all the conversation which I've just heard, because I met him at the time of the Salman Rushdie affair. And I want to say how actually the driving force behind his real deep-rooted sense of justice was there for truth, and how he always felt that the Muslim world, it was treated unjustly. And I think that's come through in his writings in many different ways. Yeah. And I think the connection between Abdullah's comments about the difference between Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Western Christianity. If Shabbir were alive today, he passed away about a year ago, but he would have then heard the sermons from the Reverend in Bethlehem, Eastern Christianity, defending the sort of justice that he would have loved that comment, because that for him represented the true Christianity, where there was no distinction between who was committing the injustice or the. So I think that kind of resonates with me, how that Eastern Christianity and Western is probably more highlighted in this book. And I thank everybody for all their comments, but I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. And thank you for that word justice, because I think Shabbir's passion for justice was greater than his passion for truth or anything else, really. Justice.
That really attracted me to him. I mean, it's these are memories now, but he was a person, he had so many qualities, and I think that's a very attractive quality for seeking some truth and justice.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Yes, from Ida. I'm not a scholar or academic, but I was one of the students of him together with Richard, and I found him extremely knowledgeable, caring, very helpful, and somebody you can go to if you want background information. So I was quite surprised by the amount and degree of critique and the balance But I think religion is a belief, as we all know. And therefore, to say what is right, what is wrong, I think is extremely dangerous, because it is what you believe to be right. And that's, I think that's where Shabbir was.
Yes, but Shabbir, as a philosopher and an academic, enjoyed disagreements, polarizations, and all these discussions. So we would have loved to have him with us, and he would have really got into this discussion. Yes. Our time has ticked away. I wanted to go around all the group and see whether anybody had a final word. But if people are able to stay, we do actually have a final word from Shabbir, I believe. Now this is Shabbir talking at the end of the book launch of the book that we edited together on reading the Bible in Islamic context. And Danny asked him how he would advise other Muslims about, whether they should read the Bible or not, what his advice to them would be.
Well, I suppose one way to answer that question is sort of autobiographically, because I didn't immediately arrive at the suspension model that Shirin mentioned. I came to that model because I thought that other models, other ways of understanding the Bible were impossible for me as a Muslim. Initially, when I first started publishing on this area of interfaith, particularly on Christianity, Kierkegaard, I did it from an entirely Islamic perspective and a philosophical perspective. When I was trained as a philosopher, I was a believing Muslim. And I found that when I look back on that work, like my book, The Light in the Enlightenment, which is about Christianity's encounter with secularism, and I'm very critical of that, the way that Christians, in my view, made certain concessions to the secular temper, which I think ultimately those liberties lead to atheism and agnosticism. So I wrote that book as a kind of warning to Muslims that if you want to engage with secular modernity, don't do it in this way. This is going to lead to ultimately a kind of apostasy.
Don't do it in which way?
Well, I felt that Christians were too eager to make accommodations to secularism rather than willing to confront secularism.
Don't follow the way the Christians are approaching secularism.
Well, on this particular way, meaning you should confront secularism rather than accommodate yourself to it, which of course is only true of the liberal scholarly wing of Christianity. I'm sure evangelicals don't accommodate themselves to secularism. I'm sure you're all very happy to confront it. But I'm saying that was where I was coming from. I was writing as a believer and then critiquing certain views in the Bible. And that was a method I found unsatisfactory. I have to say, in fairness, although I did not publish this in this particular volume, that there is an analogous method that Christians who study Islam use, meaning even someone I think like Kenneth Cragg essentially, I think, used a Christian method to assess Islam, so that for all his literary sensitivity and ability, a great deal of what he says reduces to the lament that why isn't Islam Christianity? I think he said that consistently over a long period of time. And I find that unfruitful, so I wanted to do something different. Then after that, it occurred to me that there was actually a deadlock between these two religions particularly, not only in terms of competing colonial history, but in terms of competing views about the nature of God and salvation. And obviously that deadlock has persisted. It's had violent consequences throughout Islamic and Christian history. So how could that deadlock be broken? I thought that it was very puzzling for me from a religious point of view because it involved the motives of God, which even as a philosopher I'm not hubristic enough to probe. I'm sure they cannot really be answered. So I thought that deadlock, obviously people would say, like John Hick used to say, that deadlock can be broken in an eschatological verification. When we die, we'll find out the truth. But that, in a sense, is to give up the quest on earth. I do find that deadlock puzzling. I think it is a deadlock, and it cannot really be resolved intellectually or theologically. I think it's actually resolved temperamentally by people. A certain kind of temperament likes the Christian offer, a certain kind of temperament likes the more juridical monotheism of Islam. And of course, it's possible that it may in fact be resolved in the future through military power. I mean, as Christians, you're lucky you have a Christian superpower to help you, which the Muslims don't have. So maybe, you know, the Americans will kill all the Muslims and that will resolve that deadlock. But apart from that very drastic solution to the problem, in the meantime, in terms of our more humble, modest visions that Ida has initiated, where we look at each other's scripture and look at the deepest issues. I mean, I personally think that, you know, what I was trying to do at this stage of my, you know, writing in terms of the deadlock was a bit like what I think Ida is also doing and what Kenneth Craig were doing, which is that what are the deepest issues that divide us, not point scoring about trivial matters, about single verses in the Bible or single verses in the Quran or certain aspects of Muhammad's life which may seem outrageous to Westerners. That was a kind of shallow polemic, and there's plenty of people doing that from both sides. So I want to do something more profound. But even that method I found didn't really work because it was essentially saying that there's a deadlock and that in order to resolve it, we'd have to know the motives of God, which are by definition undiscoverable. So I thought that I had to abandon that. And then finally, you know, what Shirin was referring to is that when I started doing the book on Galatians, part of the larger commentary on the entire New Testament, particularly on the Gospels, I thought that I would try to suspend my commitment to my own faith and read the Bible in as fair way as possible, in as charitable a way as possible, meaning charity here, meaning that if something seems contradictory or outrageous or wrong, to try and see how it appears to Christians. And of course, Paul is the best possible place to do that because a great deal of Pauline theology is extremely complex, even for Christians, let alone for people who are from outside the faith. So that, in summary, Danny, is what I was doing. The only thing I'd add to that is that the suspension model actually was something that went back to my work as an activist when I campaigned against Salman Rushdie and I wrote a book against him. I had to get a kind of dispensation from the religious people in Bradford who thought that reading such a book would lead to me accruing sin, meaning it's a sinful act to read it. So I wanted to explain to them that I'm only reading it for intellectual reasons. So that's actually where the idea came to me, that perhaps if I could suspend my judgment to my faith while reading a work of this type. And so, of course, the Bible is not, you know, analogous to Rushdie's book, but I'm saying from the point of view of a believer, certain judgments in the Bible are anathema to a Muslim. They're completely unacceptable. So that's the issue that I set myself. What do I do with those parts of the Bible which I cannot in good faith or conscience accept as a Muslim? That's why I did that.
All right. Good. Well, we've let Shabbir have the last word, so I won't say anything more.
I almost feel like applauding his last word.
Yeah, we should say thanks.
Yeah.